Hey there, my name is Rachael and welcome to the Magdala podcast. We at Magdala know from experience that pornography, masturbation, and other sexual addictions are not just a guy problem. The need for women to be accompanied in the journey towards healing from addiction has gone sorely unmet, and that's why we're here. Magdala exists as a space where women can find hope, healing, and freedom alongside each other from sexual addiction. Our goal is to supply you with support, community, and accountability. Here on the podcast, you'll find everything from testimonies to practical advice to dialogue about how to heal and live fully as a Catholic woman. Wherever you are in your journey, know that you're not alone, and we welcome you to this table. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Magdala podcast. This is Rachael, your host, and today we have Mary Jo Carney with us, who we had with us last time, but we still have with us this time.
I'm still here.
I don't know how to do introductions together. We're still learning. We're learning, but I've got my second cup of coffee, so there's hope on the horizon.
And I've got my third cup of water.
Wow.
So
you're a better person than I am. It's
hopefully,
fine.
Well,
we already knew it.
I spend a lot more time in the bathroom. That's all I have to say about this. It's a blessing and a curse to be a well-hydrated woman.
Oh, my word. Oh, my word. Anyway, but it's true. It's true. Our topic today is, I guess, a little bit heavier. We get into the weeds a little bit, but I think it's necessary. It's important. We're answering the question, what is porn addiction? Or can you really be addicted to porn? And I'd like to throw in, like, kind of like we said, or you were the first one out in our last episode that we did together, was we should say sexual compulsions, right? We should make sure that we have those umbrella terms. And can you really be addicted to porn? Can you be addicted to sexual behaviors such as masturbation or other, kind of lust-based compulsions? So we're going to get into the weeds of what constitutes an addiction. And this is actually, like, those of us who are working in this industry kind of know, like, this is a testy conversation in the psych world. And so you know way more about that than me, but just kind of unpack maybe quick for us, like, why is it testy?
Oh, that is a loaded question. There's a couple of reasons. One, I think, is because, I don't know, modern psychology loves to be quantitative whenever possible. And by that, I mean that it wants to use numbers to describe everything it possibly can, because numbers are just more sciencey. And psychology is totally just a science like every other science, right?
Right.
Totally.
Right.
And so when you get into something like this question we're getting into today about is porn really an addiction? Or in general, sexual compulsions, can they really be an addiction? I mean, you'll see, we'll kind of try to define it. You'll see that when we define it, we can't really use quantity. We can't really use frequency as a meter for generalized description of is it an addiction, because different people are affected differently by their addiction. You may have one person that only engages in their problem behavior, let's say once a day or 3 times a week, and yet it absolutely does, for example, disrupt their ability to function, destroy some relationships, those hallmark signs of an addiction. Other people might have like a really high tolerance. And of course, the deeper you go into addiction, the higher your tolerance becomes. It builds. But that's one reason. And then obviously the other reason is very much ethical. Our culture is extremely, I would say, over-sexualized, hypersexual, and very much a culture of like anything goes. And so I would say the predominant voices in the world of psychology today definitely prescribe that pornography use can be and should be and is normal and healthy, and might even like help you express your sexuality or assist you and your partner in growing closer and closer in your intimacy, which obviously in our experience with real women, it doesn't really, that is not really the case. No. But as Catholics and as women running a ministry, obviously we know that these things are also sinful in nature. Right. And so regardless of their frequency, regardless of your culpability in terms of whether or not it's addictive for you, whether or not it's interacting with other maybe mental, emotional dysfunction that you have, regardless of those things, it's something that's important. Right. It's something that's worth addressing because it involves the health of your soul. Yep. And really the health of the soul, the mind, the body, they go together. Yeah. You know, so we will kind of take that holistic approach in the second half when we'll talk about what can we do about this. But yeah, first and foremost, just to talk a little bit about, is porn addiction a legitimate mental illness?
Yeah, and I think it, in a biblical sense, you know, we've got John chapter 8, I believe, that says you will know the truth and the truth will make you free. I believe it's John 8:13. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a blog post for Magdala's site about this. It's like admitting that you're addicted doesn't have to be it should be sobering, ironically, that word, but it should be sobering. It should be very, like, okay, dang, like this is a reality in my life, but it can be something that leads you to healing. And I think that's what you're getting at, is that we can't heal unless we define. We can't heal unless we like hit ourselves in the face with like what we're actually doing, and have to be honest with ourselves. And I think that's where recognizing the legitimacy of sexual addiction and recognizing the legitimacy of it in our own lives is extremely important to the healing journey. But I think it's helpful if we can break down what are those tenets of an addiction, because like you pointed out, it's not about frequency. And we get that question often, like I know I do, of like, I'm not sure if I'm addicted because I use, this many times a month or whatever. And yeah, we do want to quantify it. And I've fallen into that. I've fallen into quantification as, a hallmark of addiction or healing. All depending on, how much we've got going on. So I've definitely fallen into that psych world. Quantifying is the requirement mindset. And, I unfortunately have like made that the requirement when speaking to other people on occasion until learning more about what actually defines this. But I think it's helpful if we go over what are the real tenets for addiction. Yeah, because the quantity of your behavior, it is important. It does say something about the severity of the situation. However, what I'm getting at is the other part of the severity of your situation is also taking into account your individual constitution. How is it affecting you? That's a good distinction. Yeah. I like that. You and I were kind of talking over some of and you have more to add than just these, which I like. I think these 5 are good, but we're talking about different sources and resources of like where to find how to define an addiction. And in his book Addiction and Grace that I've got in my hand right now, Dr. Gerald May, who is a psychiatrist and spiritual formator, he's a really good dude. It's a great book. He lists 5. He says tolerance, withdrawal symptoms, self-deception, loss of willpower, and distortion of attention are 5. And we can go over those if you'd prefer, or do you have others that you think are necessary to add in there? The only ones that I would add would be this focus on function. Is it disrupting your ability to function day to day? Just broadly speaking. I agree. And typically also, if it's involving secrecy, usually when things involve secrecy, that's a sign that something dysfunctional, something addictive is going on. Sure. And how is it affecting your relationships and the need to keep upping the ante, which is that tolerance factor. Right. I think those are, I think those are both really good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, the first one listed is tolerance. And so I guess in an addictive sense, explain what tolerance is.
Sure. Well, on like a neurobiological level, when you have an addiction, it actually does change the transmission of your dopamine. And it makes it almost so that, from what my understanding is, and I'm not a neuropsychologist or in that field whatsoever, but from my rudimentary understanding of reading through studies and articles,
right,
your receptors are being hit so often with the dopamine that they're becoming a little bit like blunted to it, a little like less sensitive. And so as you go along with your addictive behavior, your body has to, you have to increase the quantity or the quality of whatever it is in order to get the same high that you were getting before. And this is true for pretty much every addiction, especially substance addictions are a clear example of this.
Yep.
But it's also true with porn addictions. There are sadly some like notorious criminals, rapists, murderers, who were later found out to be using pornography.
Yeah.
And it was that very sort of sadistic pornography that they used that really inspired some of their crimes.
Right.
Because
you have to, and I'm assuming you're referencing the Ted Bundy final interview. Yes. That's one of them.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah. And I would encourage listeners to watch with caution. Because I mean, Ted Bundy's final interview is very powerful. And there's obviously a lot of, socio-cultural things behind that interview, different theories of like why he said what he did. But I mean, whether or not we believe it was authentic, the information he's portraying is exactly what you're saying, is that addiction to any substance, but especially to pornography, the building up that tolerance, you need harder and harder content in order to produce the end effect that you are desiring. And in the end, for people who find themselves in those criminal actions, it was those actions that was producing the end effect that they're looking for. Videos, magazines, whatever was available at the time, which I think it was mostly magazines, was not able to cut it. And I think tolerance is one of the ones that is a little frightening to talk about. And so we want to make sure we're doing this sensitively, but also it's been showing statistically too that women actually build up tolerance in a very different way than men do. And so the percentage of addicts of men versus women, statistically, women are still a little bit lower on the number, but at the pace of how quickly we seek out harder content, we go exponentially faster, which is a very interesting phenomenon, and one worth exploring. But I think it's also because, female sexuality is so complex, and it's very difficult sometimes to understand our own sexuality, and so harder content perhaps can become something that we turn to more and more and more in order to understand, in order to reach that desired end, and all those different things. And but I think tolerance, I don't know why, but it seems like women's tolerance is built entirely differently than men and on a different plane statistically.
Yeah, but that makes sense to me, because I feel like I don't know. I feel like women, there's a lot going on with your inner dialogue about your identity, and what makes identity is stories and like relationship and narrative. Sure. Right?
Sure.
And so there's also a possibility for a woman of like a trauma in her life playing into her addiction and her tastes.
Yeah, because that's also statistically higher.
Yes. Yeah. Your tastes and like what kinds of pornography you're looking for, they actually do it's kind of scary, but they actually do say something about yourself, about your psyche, about maybe some desires that you have or some relationships that you've had.
damage that's been done that you're trying to
yeah,
own and reconcile yourself with.
right, or needs that you have that you feel are unfulfilled, or something like that. You know, there's a lot of different like scenarios out there, you know, in the world of pornography. But anyway,
yes, and
that's a longer conversation.
Yep.
With someone more qualified than me.
And me, right there with you, but we're doing our best. Okay, so the second he lists is withdrawal symptoms. This is pretty self-explanatory, but explain a little bit more.
Sure.
Withdrawal. That's a hard word to say, by the way.
Withdrawal. Like a southern drawl.
Southern drawl.
I won't talk about this in a southern accent. I'm tempted to, but
don't do it. It's not the time.
Right. Another time. Well, yeah, withdrawal is pretty clear in substance abuse disorders, and maybe less clear to people with pornography addiction. From personal experience, I would say I always felt a certain effect like after having used a lot of pornography.
Sure.
I mean, probably also related to so much screen time, but having headache, having things like that. I don't know if I ever really experienced like withdrawal symptoms from it, but I have heard of many people who have, and it's certainly on a mental sphere. There's sort of this irritating,
right,
sort of like tick, maybe that,
right,
almost like obsessive compulsive sort of thinking of like you're obsessing about wanting to watch it, but you're withdrawing, you're trying not to, so you're having the impulse to compulsively seek it out, and you're not.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's also, when we're talking about withdrawal, it's important to recognize the difference between sedative substances and stimulant substances. So we've got, and May talks about this too, but that the withdrawal symptoms are different for those two substances. So when I'm talking about like sedative, I'm talking about like alcohol, right? Alcohol is a very good example of typically something that sedates, right? It subdues the emotions you're feeling. It numbs you out. Typically your mood, your personality like become a little more subdued, right? Especially with prolonged use. And then you can have erratic behaviors arise from that, subduing. So there's two extremes. But when you are withdrawing from a sedative, he talks about how that's typically the substance that produces hyperactivity to the point of like even seizures or things like that. So like withdrawal from alcohol is very different than withdrawal from pornography, because pornography is a stimulant. So because pornography is a stimulant, oftentimes the withdrawal symptoms that we experience can be things like simply like headaches or depression or anxiety. We can experience a lot of mental health effects. Lethargy is a huge one as well, just like a certain laziness. I think I experienced a little bit of a little jumpiness, but also just lethargy. There was some laziness there that I couldn't I was like, why do I feel like I'm a little bit foggy? What's going on?
Fatigue.
Yep. And that's because when you let go of a stimulant, and your body's like, wait, I'm used to being regularly stimulated in this way, it falls into, I guess, a more sedated state.
Yeah, because you have been training your mind and body to reach for a certain level of stimulation.
Yeah, and you're no longer.
And you're not having that anymore.
Nope.
Yeah, this is actually something I have noticed over time that I've realized, wow, maybe my desired level of stimulation really has been affected by that habit that I had in the past.
Yeah, that's something for ongoing
it's
healing.
Definitely caused me to see myself in a new light in terms of what things I choose to do day to day, or what goals I have in life, or even just my expectations of activities and relationships.
That's
I'm
huge.
Sometimes expecting everything to feel like woo, and it's just not going to. That's not all of it.
Yeah, and especially when you point out, and you shared a little bit of your testimony in our last episode, which I would encourage everybody to listen to. But then, in my testimony as well, we both encountered pornography in a very formative time. Yeah. When puberty is a time where you are becoming aware of yourself as a sexual being, what sexuality is, what that means in relations, or in relationship to other people, to other men and women, it's quite a freaky time, and everybody feels so awkward, and it's terrible. But like when pornography like enters into somebody's psyche at that time, like, yes, of course it's going to be formative. You know, the materials that we take in are formative. And that's why we have to be very careful with education. That's why education is an art. It's something to be delicate with. It's because we're forming very, very impressionable young minds. Yeah. But I've even noticed something like similar in myself. I like that you're pointing this out. Just, you know, when using a substance like pornography or engaging in a sexually compulsive behavior, you know, you start out like you give in to the compulsion, and you start out on this plane, and then it reaches, you know, like fairly quickly it reaches its peak, and then it drops back down. And so it makes sense what you're saying, that like we kind of like something in our brains became conditioned to experience this euphoric high in our activity. You know, like at some point I will reach euphoria and then I will drop back down. But as long as I reach euphoria, I'm content to drop back down. And that does translate to our emotional life. So even our spiritual life, I would say, is like, okay, are we expecting this euphoric moment when a lot of freedom, which is what our last episode was on, is recognizing the ups and downs, the waves, that normal life moves a lot more up and down, and that we can, and that it's a little more level, and that we can stay level, and that's good, and that's where true satisfaction is to be found. But it makes perfect sense that that we would, want euphoria. Something in the back of our heads is conditioned to experience that. Yeah.
I would add just a little bit here as well, that the way that I used pornography was also for the purpose of dissociation and numbing, actually. And it was actually Father Sean Kilcawley who told me this about myself, because at the time I was really struggling with a condition in which like dissociation
is high.
It was one of the things that I was dealing with. Yeah. And I never thought about it like that before, that when I was turning on some media like that, which was stimulating, but also kind of mind numbing, that I was engaging in dissociation in kind of a different way, and that I was like alienating myself from my own body in a mental way by like watching these activities of other bodies. And we'll get into that more later. But that's another, if you're somebody that uses pornography in that way as kind of like perhaps more of a dissociative way, more of a sedative way, then also withdrawing from that. I don't know. I think that's why my first answer to the question withdrawal was like, well, you're going to have a lot of mental restlessness, because withdrawing from a sedative would really, like you said, actually kind of increase like restlessness.
And I wonder if perhaps that's part of the difficulty in defining sexual addiction, is that perhaps it can be used both as a sedative and a stimulant.
I would argue yes. Yeah. I would argue
that seems correct to me.
It can be used both ways. It can be used both ways by
the
same person. Yeah. It is definitely more tricky to nail down.
Yeah, I like that. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, the third category that May puts out there is self-deception, which I think is way too real. This is the one where I was like, yep. That hits different, Gerald. It's different. No, but I think that, and he defines self-deception as just what we do in our own minds to perpetuate our own addictive behavior, what we tell ourselves in order to allow ourselves to continue. And this is, I think, where we get into the real fight against the sin involved in porn addiction and just sexual compulsion in general. But unpack that a little bit, like self-deception in
I think you should unpack that one, because it hit you really strongly.
Because it hit different?
And I did the last two. It's your turn.
Okay. Well, I think it's the process of, in the moment, when you're being tempted or when you're feeling that compulsion, it's the little things of like, okay, what's one more time? Or I'm never going to be able to do anything different, so this is fine. Like the lies take very, very different forms. And this is part of why, our second session when we work through small groups is identifying those lies, identifying the lies that lead you to the moment of giving into your compulsion and temptation, and then the moment, like, or the lies that come afterward that will perpetuate this addictive cycle, right? So, for example, a pretty common lineup, you know, taking from small group and my own experience is like, so we're leading up to it, we're feeling the compulsion, and so we say, yeah, you know, I did it last week, what's one more time? Or there's not going to be anything better for me, I'm never going to be able to get free, so I might as well, like, this will be the only thing that fills this need. And, you know, here we go. And you give into the compulsion, and then afterward it's like, you don't deserve anything better, and you will always give into this need, right? So it's so weird how the lies we hear afterward reaffirm and confirm for us, I guess is a better word, the lies that we hear prior, and that keeps us trapped in the addictive cycle. But our brain does that, like, to fight off any act of the will that is, you know, trying to fight against what we know to be an addictive behavior, what we know to be a sinful behavior. And that's where you just get that clash of like, okay, my soul wants something and my flesh wants something different, and here we go. And because, yeah, your mind, in order to keep that stimulant, because it makes you feel safe, you know, it makes you feel loved, known, safe, secure, seen, whatever you're going to for it. It makes you feel that way. So your mind will deceive your own self in order to keep that. Yeah. In order to keep that place of connection, however false it is. It's such a false form of connection. But it's,
if it wasn't doing something, you wouldn't be turning to it.
Right. So we kind of have to subvert our own selves in order to stay with it. So the self-deception is our own mind, and that can happen in varying levels, right? But every woman, and every man, but every woman who is addicted to, you know, some sort of sexual compulsion believes a lie about themselves. That is inherent. There is no addiction without the lying to yourself. And it can be very subtle. It can be very subtle, or it can be super obvious. But that's why a lot of times, you know, sexual addiction can cross with body dysmorphia, or other, you know, just sometimes even like gender dysphoria or different things. Like, we can be dysmorphic or dysphoric in other ways, and that can lead to sexual compulsion because we're already in that place of believing lies about ourselves, you know? And seeking that out as an affirmation to get rid of those lies, but it perpetuates a cycle. I don't know if that made any sense.
No, it does.
I think I'm trying.
I think that every mental, you know, this is kind of somewhat informed by my Catholic studies and upbringing, but I think that every mental illness has components of self-deception, like you're saying.
That's a good point.
And frankly, also, if I could put it a different way, just like a disconnect with reality.
Oh, yeah.
Like most mental illness involves the fact that you are not perceiving yourself quite right. You're not perceiving the world quite right, or your relationships. And so part of healing from any mental illness, including addiction, is to reestablish what's real, what's reality,
right?
Who am I? And, you know, who are the people that I'm relating with, and what is this world?
What is true about me? What is true about God? What is true about other people?
Yeah.
That's the truth will make you free. Okay. The next one. Oh, actually, this is a good quote to conclude the self-deception. Gerald May says, "Mind tricks are so malignant and have such a corrosive effect on self-esteem that I have to devote an entire chapter to them." Like, we destroy our own self-esteem through self-deception. I think that's pretty crazy. And the mind tricks we play on ourselves. Okay, the next requirement, the next tenet that he poses is loss of willpower. Loss of willpower against an addictive behavior.
Well, yeah.
Thoughts, cries of heresy.
No,
soliloquies.
It goes with the increased tolerance. I mean, the more and more you're flooding your system, whatever addiction it may be, the more you're going to lose your ability to say no.
Yeah.
On a neurological level, your like frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, where you're making those higher level executive function decisions, you're weakening it. the more that you go into an addiction. And yeah, that one makes sense. I don't know
Right.
if there's anything else that needs to be said. It's clear to me that this does happen in porn addiction, and that it's a legitimate addiction because of it.
Right. And I think this is one of the easiest ones to identify when we're dealing with addicts or with our own addictions. And disclaimer, one of the most beautiful things about this book, Addiction and Grace, that we're pulling these from by Dr. Gerald May, is that he says we're all addicted to something. Like he's laying out like categories that can be applied to so many things other than your typical alcohol, drugs, sex addiction, gambling addiction, like so many others. He talks about how we can be addicted to people's respect. We can be addicted to work. Work addiction is pretty obvious.
A lot of addictions related to your relationship with food.
Oh yeah,
addicted
absolutely.
to eating too much or too little. I mean,
or particular types.
Most people have, I would say, at least like 2 areas that there's like an addictive relationship with. You know, it's always the question of, is this clinical? Is this, as we said, disrupting my day-to-day ability to function? Is it destroying my relationships?
Or is it something that I can...
Is it something that I'm keeping very secretive? Or and
some addictions are bigger than others, and that's where we get into, obviously, things like pornography addiction. But I think, you know, the loss of willpower is easy to identify because you can always hear it, you know? You're like, I can stop whenever I want. If you hear that phrase, it's hilarious because you're like, all right, go for it, you know, won't do it kind of thing. Like,
if you had to say that, then why? Yeah,
exactly.
Why would you have to say that?
And I remember saying that myself. It's like, no. Like especially in high school when I was learning what pornography addiction was, and I thought it was only a male thing. And I was like, no, there's no way, you know, and it was just like not wanting to reconcile myself with the fact that I was addicted. And that was one of the reasons I gave, is like, well, I can stop whenever I want. And it's like, okay, but could you, kid? You know, like, probably not. And I think we hear that all the time with different addictions, but that's a common one when somebody is not willing to own their own sex addiction or pornography addiction, or, you know, whatever is the lie. I can stop whenever I want.
Yeah. Which it's kind of true. You probably could stop whenever you want, but with what degree of struggle, with what degree of withdrawal? When you do make your attempt at stopping, what happens?
Yeah,
and that will tell you a lot.
I mean, I think that's true to a certain point, but I think there's also like...
Oh yeah, there's certainly a point where it's like...
willpower is not enough.
You're really out of control.
Yeah, but you do have to have...
Yeah, objectively speaking, I mean, it is possible that you could stop whenever you want, objectively speaking, but subjectively,
that application...
and at what cost?
Right. At what cost to your psyche? I think, too, that it's important to recognize, like, willpower does have a massive role to play in recovery. Like, you do have to choose it. You do have to decide to be done. But I think recovery happens when you decide to be done, and then you equip yourself with the means, kind of like you're pointing out, you equip yourself with the means to be done, recognizing that you cannot do it on willpower alone. Yeah. You equip yourself with accountability or physical activity or... all the above. Yep. Anything, prayer, you know, like all of the things that help us recover, which we'll get into later. But that's loss of willpower. We love it. And then... the next one that he lays out is distortion of attention. I think this kind of relates to your disrupts day-to-day ability to function. You know, distortion of attention, functionality. Kind of get into that. Like, what does that look like? Generally speaking, you are not living the life that you would really desire to live. Right. Really desire to live. I mean, if you're really honest with yourself, with that addiction in place. You know, when you're at your very best state, and you ask yourself, okay, self, you know, like many people do this at the beginning of a new year. What would I like to accomplish this year? What would I like to do? I would like to travel to these places. I would like to excel in this career. I would like to have a really good romantic relationship, or I would like to discern about, you know, this religious calling. I would like to take up these hobbies. You know, we all
in our hearts, we all have really wonderful plans and goals and dreams for ourselves if we're honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
And porn and other addictions, all addictions take those down.
Yeah.
You know, we all have the same 24 hours in a day.
Yeah.
And we all know someone in our lives or maybe out there in the public who truly is ticking off like a lot of their dreams, right? They're like killing it at the gym. They're like having, you know, nobody has a perfect relationship, but they've got like a pretty functional relationship. They have a spiritual life. They're doing a great job, whatever it is. Those people that are very functional, odds are that they don't have an addiction getting in and mucking everything up. That's what addictions do. It takes away the precious time, part of the precious 24 hours that we all have in a day that would otherwise be devoted to those beautiful dreams and desires that you have.
That was so well put. Yeah.
So yeah, it disrupts your day-to-day ability to function, but also your ability to live a full life in general.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can sense that it's holding you back from one or many of those goals.
Yeah.
You can sense that I cannot achieve X, Y, and Z as long as this is in place.
Right.
There's a conscience, like a conscience sense there, of just like this gets in my way.
Right. Or like what should have been filling that time. Right. For example, when we were exposed to pornography in our middle school years, like what should have been filling that time? When I continued to use it in high school, when I probably should have been like enjoying time with friends or my hobbies, like that's what should have been filling that time. But instead, here I was using this drug, which was also just worsening my view of myself, my social confidence, my body image.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. That's such a good point. And we can get into in a little bit just like how maybe this can be its own thing, but just not regretting what you just said, like not living with regret.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. What should have been filling our time. But get into involving secrecy. I think this ties to self-deception a little bit, but this is where we get into deceiving others and those around us.
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny because you're taking what is a self-deception, this act that you're committing, and you're telling yourself, it's fine, go for it. But yeah, you can't tell anyone else about it. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a great point. So what does that say about it? You know, nobody wants to hide their accomplishments in life. When they do something wonderful and they do something good, they want to tell those close to them and celebrate.
Yeah.
And even if it's something as small as like a really, you know, hard day at work that they got through really well. And I think that's just how it is. When you have something that you're doing that's true, that's good, that's beautiful, you want to share it with others.
Right.
So they can also enjoy that. And if you have something that you can't, you know, like sin, like an addiction, yeah, to me, that's a sign that the behavior is, it's actually a sign that it could be an addiction and not just a one-time event either, right? How many of us have had like a bad habit that we weren't practicing all the time and we like have a fluke or we have a weird day and we like, you know, you're talking to your best friend, your spouse, and you're like, oh yeah, I did this today. Pfft, can you believe that? Like, what the heck, you know? And maybe they give you some love or give you a good piece of advice. But if you have an ongoing addiction, you don't have any intention of telling anyone about it because you want to leave the door open to do it again and again and again.
And you don't want anybody to stop you.
Yeah.
And you don't want the guilt of facing the repercussions of your actions in other people.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, yeah, and there's the whole spiritual side too of it grows in isolation. It grows in secrecy, and so Satan loves when we keep things secret, when we keep our sins secret, because he can can really grow their chokehold on us there.
Right.
But yeah, and then destroying relationships, I think, goes into the functionality point.
Yeah.
But I think with extreme addictions, especially, like, that's, you know, kind of what you just got at. Like, the secrecy destroys our relationships. The withdrawal destroys our relationships. Like, there's so many different elements of this that come into the destruction of relationships. But I mean, yeah, I've known too many people who have to go through a breakup due to porn, or a divorce due to porn or sex addiction.
Yeah, this particular addiction destroys relationships.
Yep.
Since our sexuality is so, like, intricately interwoven with our identities and
intimacy
and our ability to make a gift of ourselves.
Yep.
To others, not just in a sexual way, just in general.
No. Yeah, I mean, sexuality is
in general.
It's the expression of the interior, you know. And so if something is harming our sexuality, it's harming the interior. We can't separate the two.
And I would say with this one too, especially with pornography, it's not always clear that it's destroying relationships if you, like, haven't ever dated anyone or anything, but you have to ask yourself the question at some point, like, why is it that I don't have, like, a healthy social life, or that like I'm not, you know, and I've never been in, like, a romantic relationship or something. There's all kinds of valid reasons other than pornography for those things. You know, we're living in a world where we move around a lot, and we all have other non-sexual sin related things that we need to work through to have healthy romantic relationships. And if you're a woman, you know, and you're looking for that strong Catholic man, then you can't really just, like, start a relationship whenever with whoever you want. It is a gift. However, I've certainly had to ask myself the question, how has pornography affected my openness to romantic relationship? Wow. If I'm being honest with myself, it's not that in my life, it's not that pornography, like, destroyed a relationship, because I didn't have one.
Right.
But it definitely had an impact on, like, my openness to them and the way I was viewing men, and even sort of, like, tearing down my social life, like I said, because it really impacted my body image in a bad way.
Yeah.
So
thank you for sharing that, because I think that's real, and I experienced something similar. It was like, yeah, I didn't necessarily have a relationship to destroy at the time when I was really, like, addicted, but it affected my perception of my male friends, of the men around me. And for many women, that's the reality is, okay, I can't look at a man in a way that's dignified. I can't look at a woman in a way that's dignified. That's the experience for many women as well, is lust knows no boundaries, and it crosses lines into your female friendships. Yeah. It leaves no stone unturned. Yeah. So I think that, yeah, I like how you're talking about how it implicitly destroys relationships, or destroys the capacity for future relationships. Because, yeah, like, learning to see people correctly again is part of the healing process. And it's beautiful once you get there. But yeah, it destroys your capacity for the other. And it's a very, very difficult thing, especially if you're pursuing the sacrament of marriage or a vocation to marriage. You know, you have to be able to correctly see and receive another person. And that's where pornography and marriage really, really butt heads. But I mean, pornography butts heads with a vocation to the religious life as well, or single life, because, I mean, you have to be able to see others as they are in those vocations as well. But
yeah, it just destroys relationships or prevents healthy ones from taking place, and makes it more difficult.
Yes.
You know, not impossible.
Nope.
If you decide to recover, you can recover, but it does leave an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think it's important to touch on, before we kind of get into maybe what can we do when we realize we're addicted. Can you unpack, because you know so much more about this than me, but just, like, the DSM and its refusal to incorporate certain addictions into its manual.
The
Mixed
DSM.
feelings about the DSM.
The DSM. Well, I have been reading through this book, which is super well known in the world of psychology and trauma-informed care, by Bessel van der Kolk, called The Body Keeps the Score. It's a wonderful book. And I wanted to share this quote from the book that he wrote because it kind of cracked me up. So I'll just read this. He says, "The foreword to the landmark 1980 DSM-3 was appropriately modest and acknowledged that this diagnostic system was imprecise, so imprecise that it should never be used for forensic or insurance purposes. As we will see, that modesty was short-lived."
Wait, so okay, for our listeners though, what is the DSM? Really
quick? I'm sorry. The DSM stands for Diagnostic Statistic Manual.
Yep.
And it really is known to be like the Bible of mental illness.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
it's like the Wikipedia page of mental illness. It's basically a guidebook to what are all the things that could possibly be wrong with you.
Yeah.
Or anyone. And let's just, write down all the criteria of every disorder. And I want to be clear that I am not against the DSM as a concept or even in its like present form.
Like as a resource.
Yeah.
But the Bible of mental illness, I like that you kind of throw it out there.
Yeah.
It's not the end all be all.
It's not the end all be all.
Yeah.
The importance of labels, in my opinion, in the world of mental health care is so that every person can find the treatment that is best suited to their problems.
Yes.
And that is the end goal. And what is often our human tendency instead of that is to find out that we have some condition or self-diagnose ourselves with some disorder and then spend the rest of our lives freaking out about it. / victimizing ourselves,
right?
/ deciding that we're just always going to live with this and that we're a victim, and it's just not true. And so the label is important so that you can have a really guided treatment.
Yes, that's crucial.
But just because something's not in the DSM
doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
And this is also important because so many of us we're all very unique in what things we present with in terms of mental dysfunction. Let's say that you've got like 2 of the criteria of OCD, but 5 of the criteria of BPD, but 2 of the criteria of some other, like you could go on and on. Every person is a unique combination. Yep. A lot of us have different, factors, different features of various disorders we struggle with. And we don't necessarily have like those disorders full blown at a clinical level. Some people do. But it doesn't mean that, those couple of criteria of this disorder or that disorder are not valid in your life, and that knowing that could guide your treatment correctly. And so I would say this is why I know you and I feel that like pornography addiction does belong in the DSM.
Absolutely.
As a legitimate mental illness, and a legitimate addiction.
Yeah. Because
it is. Yeah. It is a legitimate addiction. However, in the latest, from the last time I looked into this, the latest edition of the DSM, they were reluctant even to include gambling addiction.
That's hilarious. That is hilarious.
Which is like a very clearly an addiction that some people are struggling with.
Right.
So as it stands today, research is considered like insufficient to include excessive sexual behavior, internet use, compulsive shopping and stealing, and gambling, even though we all know that these things are dysfunctional and can like constitute a disorder as they are alone. I think part of the problem of this is that they're often just like another symptom of a very serious condition, like a personality disorder or a mood disorder. They're often just like one other thing. They're not often standalone features. However, I think that they are serious enough in and of themselves that they could be considered as standalone disorders.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, all right, after talking about the DSM and all of kind of the negatives of defining addiction and whatnot, we want to visit in the next episode kind of what to do once you realize you're addicted. So just some practical tips on fighting temptation and just regaining mental and physical health. But Mary Jo and I are both very creative, I guess, as a word to say in our recovery. Especially you. I think you found such like wonderfully creative outlets, like just to help you and others recover. So we're gonna kind of shoot the breeze on those sources in our next episode.
Yep.
But I think concluding again on the note of, and you touched on it so well when you were saying the importance of label is so that you can recover.
Yeah.
Like label is only to help you heal.
The label is
not to keep you down and make you a victim. Yes.
The label is not you.
Yeah.
I struggled with this so much because I went through a couple different labels in the DSM before I independently discovered what was my most like accurate diagnosis. My very, very intelligent and wonderful Catholic psychologist was not going to tell me like what it was that fit me the best, because he probably knew once I found this label. I then spent so many years still recovering from it, but during my recovery from it, just psyching myself out. Yeah. You know, when I would have a setback, and here I'm speaking of like my condition generally and not pornography, when I would have a setback or an episode of dissociation or something like that, I would just become flooded with this feeling of enslavement to this condition.
Yeah.
That I at one point in my life met all the criteria for. And you know, these things can become like self-fulfilling prophecy type relationship with you and your condition. And so that's why I say like it's so important that everyone know that yes, the label counts for your treatment, but it doesn't count for who you are, and it doesn't count for what you can be and who you will be. It doesn't define you.
No, we don't live under the label. We live with the label.
Precisely.
We live, we can't ignore the label. We can't pretend it's not there, but we do not live under its power or definition. We associate with it so that we can no longer be associated with
and
it.
Also so that you can take it seriously and others in your life can take it seriously.
Yes.
I think that's another thing about the DSM that is important, because mental emotional illness is for the most part unseen.
Yeah.
Other than any behaviors that you may be carrying out. But a lot of us walk around with, you know, or have walked around with conditions where we're not like showing our illness, our mental illness in any particular way. This was true for me with pornography. It was really
same.
It was really the only addiction that I was taking part in. There were maybe like one or two other bad habits that I had, but also very secretive, also not things that anyone else could see or could tell that I was doing. Right. And so in the one sense, it's incredibly validating when you actually discover a list of dysfunctional criteria and you're like, wow, I'm dysfunctional just like that. Yeah. It's real. It's not just like all in my mind. Like other people experience this. But yes, just that everyone would know that it's going to help you to guide your treatment, and beyond that, it doesn't have to limit you. Yeah.
And that's a good concluding note. And we will talk about maybe some things to add into treatment in our next episode. Woo-hoo. So if you like this episode, follow, subscribe, whatever platform you're on, and whatever the button says, hit the button. But also prayerfully consider supporting us on Patreon by becoming a patron. We are donor supported, and we are extremely grateful for anybody who supports us, and whether that's financially or through prayer. We need prayer more than anything. So please continue to support us through your prayers. Prayerfully consider supporting us financially. But all in all, know that you are in our prayers, and we will catch you soon.
Adios.
Thanks for joining the conversation today on the Magdala podcast. If you want to learn more, join a support group with other women on the journey, or find more content, visit magdalaministries.org. If you want to continue to be a part of the conversation, like, subscribe, and share this podcast. But most importantly, wherever you are in the journey of healing, know that you're not alone and you don't have to hide anymore. We're excited to welcome you to the table next time. God bless.